there, everyone. Welcome to Storytime. I am Dr. Jennifer Bird. I'm a biblical scholar, and I care very much about what people do with what they find in the Bible. And I was asked last week if I would talk about the suffering servant. So hitting hard today. Yeah. I guess so. If that's how you see this. I think it's helpful to talk about something's off a little bit here. I think it's helpful to talk about anything that people have misunderstood, right? And this is as it happens, a lot of people misunderstand. Let me not say it that way. As it happens, a lot of the content in the prophets are ripe for being read a particular way that is very Christian and is very different from the way the writings themselves initially were intended to be read. How about that? So I absolutely understand when people do think of reading the prophets through the lens of who this guy Jesus is, right? There are very, very good reasons for people in the Christian tradition to read that way. That is how it is demonstrated for people in the Gospels. The Gospel of Matthew is kind of the big contender along those lines, that Matthew quotes scripture and quotes things from the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh, the third section wasn't completed really, or officially complete in the first century Common Era. So he pulls from the law and prophets to talk about Jesus's life. And so, we have this example in the very first gospel in terms of the canon for Christians, demonstrating a way to engage the prophets that people have misunderstood to a certain degree. So let's talk about a couple of these things really quickly. And then I want to spend most of the time talking about the book of Isaiah and what's going on with the suffering servant passage. But this is, when I do an intro course to the Newer Testament, talking about Matthew's gospel, talking about how to understand what the four gospels are doing in general, is something I really just prefer to do in person. It's really hard for me to do some of these conversations by video and not in person, even live, because I really want to try to connect with people on this. It is absolutely understandable that there are so many millions of people who essentially think about the prophets as predicting Jesus. There's a good reason for that, okay? I think that's important to note up front, and because I don't think it's helpful to be rude to people, but being better informed, being better educated about these things means you have to change the way you think about things. So when we have Matthew quoting something from one of the prophets to talk about Jesus's life, that can be read a couple different ways. One of them, the way I think we ought to read it, is to see Matthew is making connections between Jesus's life and experiences and those of his ancestors, the people he is connected to. And Matthew's gospel is trying to make a very strong, very, very strong connection between Jesus and his own people, tradition, scriptures, all of that. So that when he quotes from the Hebrew Bible, from the law and the prophets, and then says, this happened in Jesus's life to fulfill this or this or this or this or this or this or this, what he means is not, this was predicted 600 years ago and now it's finally happening. That's how many people interpret that and read that line. But what I think he was trying to say is it adds more meaning to it. So this gets at the very basic, the really startling thing for me, and I've been reading it differently for so long, sometimes I forget how startling it was for me initially. So I want to name that also. It was startling for me in seminary to have someone tell me that the prophets were writing for the people at that point in their own point in time. They weren't writing for people 600, 700, 800 years later. They were writing for the people they were addressing, the people they lived among, or in the case of when it's addressed specifically or primarily to leadership, there's some correction going on. There's some get your crap in order kind of content going on. But it's for them. It was initially directed at the people they were living with. And yes, these kinds of behaviors happen over and over. And so what happened in 722 BCE, what was going on in 750 BCE has played out. I'm sorry, I have a cat who wants to be a part of things today. Has played out in other times and places or at other points in time. And that's just because that's the way of human nature. And that's the way of people in power abusing their position of power. Hang on a second. Hi. She needs some attention today. Here's Minerva. You want to say hi? You want to say hi, cute girl? Yeah, okay. So that there are similar things happening in Jesus's life and time to what was happening for the Israelite people prior to being conquered by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Like, that's just because these things happen. This is the way of the world. It's so yes, you can use something that was written in the 8th century BCE and use it to talk about something in the first century Common Era. You can do that, and it kind of can make sense. But to say that the prophets themselves were only or were primarily predicting Jesus is one of a handful of deeply anti-Judaic things within the Christian tradition. To say they were predicting Jesus is so disrespectful to the people who actually wrote these things, said these things, enacted these things. It's, and I didn't think about it that way until someone actually just pointed it out to me. So I think it's important to keep that in mind too, that for people who do read it this way, they read the prophets as if the prophets were written for Jesus or for the people following Jesus. When you're taught to read it that way, then that's just the way you read it. And you do often need someone to just say, let's think about why that might not be the best way to do this. Okay. So I think part of what I'm trying to point out here is the prophets I think are best read and understood in the context they were written in and for those people. That you can also then use them to talk about things is just a function of literature and human nature. And I'm very interested in people of the Christian tradition to stop presuming or to stop asserting that content in the prophets is specifically trying to predict Jesus. Sure. I mean, I have students every term at, 4 terms a year. I have students every term who absolutely believe that. And I get that, right? So part of why Christians misunderstand is that they are taught to misunderstand it. Also, this example of Matthew, and then we have, where he's quoting and, referring to these passages to give more meaning, not necessarily to say that was written 600 years ago and now it's finally happening. No, that's not what he was doing. But then we also have later writings in the Newer Testament that also teach people to think that way. So Christians' own scriptures teach them to be disrespectful to other parts of their scriptures. This is another element of the Christian tradition that is anti-Judaic. And it's deeply ironic because they're drawing upon these scriptures, so they need them to make the point they're making, and yet they're being disrespectful in the way they're handling it. And that disrespectful handling of Hebrew Bible passages is canonized in the Newer Testament. So, it's a bit of a conundrum that the Christian scripture, the scriptures of the Christian Newer Testament, do teach Christians to be disrespectful to some of their own scriptures in the way that they're taught to handle it. So I think I've said that 2 or 3 times in slightly different ways. So I think we can move on. What do you think, Minerva? Okay, so there's all that. I'm sorry. I just saw a long comment that I thought I'd want to put up here, but maybe not. Okay. Thank you, Tramp Cat. I appreciate that. So let's look at. I have a very short slideshow. That's what these are called. So to talk about the suffering servant, which is, it's kind of fun the way the numbers played out. So his suffering servant starts in Isaiah chapter 52, verse 13, and then switch the 2 and the 3. Goes through 53, verse 12. Anyway, that's how I remembered it all through seminary. Okay. So let's just talk a couple things about the book of Isaiah itself. It is, the content of it addresses 3 separate points in time, or general points in time, general chapters of the Israelite people's story. So the first Isaiah, as we refer to it when you're talking academically, is the first 39 chapters. And I'm actually going to read I'm going to read 39 with you and then go into 40. It's one of the most clear examples. It's so very fascinatingly clear when you read it this way, that we have something going on in the first 39 chapters, and the tone changes, the need changes, the content changes in chapters 40 to 55. It's very different. So first Isaiah is pre-exile, pre-Babylonian exile, okay? Which means that first Isaiah is predominantly calling people to get their shit together, right? It's predominantly calling out the the bad behaviors, the bad leadership, and the breaking of covenantal relationship, which is a shorthand for saying you're not treating your people well. You're getting rich on the backs of your people. You're not participating in upright international dealings, like whatever, right? But that all these essentially moral failings of the people in leadership or in the priesthood or whatever is summed up in terms of covenant relationship. Okay. So the first 39 chapters is before they've been conquered. So that's where you get language that threatens that God is going to come in and use Assyria as a rod to chasten the people. Like there's threatening language, there's get your butt in gear language, all that kind of stuff, holding the feet to the fire. Second Isaiah is addressing people who are in exile. So the tone changes dramatically and it becomes comfort my people. It's addressing people who are, there's no reason or need to tell them to get their shit together anymore. They're in exile and suffering. And there are a couple different ways that the prophet writing in Isaiah's name, whoever the person is writing in his name, a couple different metaphors and language there that they draw upon to try to speak a form of comfort. Okay. And so then the third Isaiah then is the last 11 chapters, 56 to 66. And it changes not as significantly as the change between first and second Isaiah, but you can see a difference. There's a shift looking ahead to being restored, the restoration of Israel, the return to Jerusalem, which does happen when the Persians have taken over, right? So, there's a good 150 years, right? So the southern, let's see, 722 is the Assyrians, 587 is the Babylonians, right? And then 539 is when the Persians come through and conquer and allow or send people back to Jerusalem if they want to go. So we're covering, what is that? 150, more than that. Yeah. 180, 100, whatever. You can do the math. I should know the numbers off the top of my head. I was thinking it was 250, but 250 isn't right because that's too far. That's too long. But the point is, right, it's written at different points in time. So, and what we're looking at in terms of the suffering servant then comes in the middle section, this comfort my people, some form of, they're in exile. It's addressed to the people in exile. Of course, there's some who are still back in Jerusalem, but it's addressed to people in exile. And there's a lot of comfort and speaking of the suffering that they're experiencing there. I think that's, right. So before we look at Isaiah, let's look at one other passage from this same second Isaiah that talks about my servant. And this is, I didn't have time to do a whole like deep dive into every single time that the Lord, through the mouthpiece of whoever's speaking, calls the people my servant. I'm sure there's a book or 5 or 10 out there that do this in some way, shape, or form. I just thought it would be helpful to look at one passage. So I'm certain there are others. There's one that's quoted actually to talk about Jesus fleeing Egypt. But anyway, let's just look at this one. Isaiah chapter 41, verses 8, 9, and 10. And so I have 8 and 9 on this slide. But you, Israel, my servant. I mean, it couldn't be more clear. Do you see what I'm saying? You, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen. So the offspring of Abraham, my friend. So one thing I want to talk about briefly also is the parallelism that happens in Hebrew poetry. This content from the content in the prophets, that's the proclamation of God speaking through the prophet, will show up. It'll be depicted or presented in kind of poetic form. And that's when it has, just short lines instead of just being continuous prose. And poetry in the Hebrew Bible didn't rhyme the way we think of it doing. It didn't necessarily have the same kind of beat and meter in the same way. Sometimes it did, but they were more kind of fun play on words. There was the most predominant poetic device within the Hebrew Bible poetry is this parallelism. And so Hebrew Bible poetry shows up obviously in the Psalms, but it shows up here in the prophetic pronouncements. It shows up in Ecclesiastes. It shows up in certain points throughout, briefly, in lots of places. The song after God parts the Red Sea in Exodus chapter 15, they sing a song, right? That's laid out in poetic or lyrical formatting. And so that's poetry or song. Okay. So the parallelism plays out in a couple different ways. So we have all these names for the different types of parallelisms that exist, but this is a synonymous parallelism. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I've chosen. 2 different ways to say the same thing, right? Israel is the same thing as Jacob, because Jacob is the father of all the Israelite clans, and Jacob's name is changed to Israel, all right? So my servant, the one I've chosen, right? So we're saying it one way, and then we're repeating it for emphasis. And then this is kind of an added on line, the offspring of Abraham, my friend. So all kinds of interesting things in terms of connecting to their Abrahamic origins, all that stuff. Remember, they're in exile, right? So these are words that will be in some level meant to encourage or comfort, right? You whom I took from the ends of the earth and called from its farthest corners. Do you see how that's a parallelism? They're saying kind of the same thing twice, right? Saying to you, you are my servant, I have chosen you and not cast you off. So it's pretty clear to me that this segment of Isaiah, the author, is pretty clear when saying my servant is one of the ways we're going to talk about the people of Israel, the Israelites. They're not called Jews until they return from exile. So we're still in the Israelite time frame. And then verse 10, do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be afraid, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my victorious right hand. You may be familiar with that passage, but it's right? Think about the context of this. You are my servant. I have chosen you. Chosen you, chosen, right? You're my servant. You're my servant. How many times, right? 4 times we're told that. And then this, do not fear, for I'm with you. This is a verse that some people tattoo on their bodies, right? It's a very common, it's a familiar and well-loved verse. What is important to me is that we keep in mind this in context. This is encouraging for people who are in exile, right? That is exactly the kind of content they need because they are down and out, right? You don't need to tell this to people who are ruling the world. You know what I'm saying? So, my servant is, biblically speaking, is clearly defined as being the people of God, God's people. Excuse me, I have a tickle. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. All right. Having a good day today. Having a good day. All right. Okay. So let's look at Isaiah 52:13 to 53:12, shall we? Are there any questions before I go on? I've been ignoring comments. Doesn't look like there's anything specific here. Okay, so let's do this then. Let's make sure I have the right chapter pulled up, which I did not. Isaiah 52:13. Let Zion rejoice. Hi. Oh, I told you I was going to look at chapter 39 and 40 with you, and I actually want to do that. I'm sorry. I said yeah, because it's pretty stunning. When you okay, I need to explain. We have a new cat. There's a new cat in the house, and I think this is a little bit of acting out to get specifically for attention. I'm sorry about that. Anyway, okay, so let's read chapter 39 very briefly, because it's first of all, it's just funny to me. It's just funny content. And okay, envoys from Babylon welcomed. I love the way they title some of the stuff. So at that time, King Merodach-Baladan, son of Baladan of Babylon, sent envoys with letters and a present to Hezekiah. Hezekiah was the king of Judah, so the southern kingdom. For he heard that he had been sick and had recovered. Hezekiah welcomed them. I do want to preface this by saying I crack up when I read this, and I'm like, yeah, and I don't know that it's entirely fair to Hezekiah. I don't necessarily know that this is true, historically speaking. And I kind of hope it's just somebody's really just throwing him under the bus. Because, anyway, I just want to say that this is a good passage to kind of take with a grain of salt. Hezekiah welcomed them. So we're talking about people from Babylon, right? So this is, Babylon has taken over. Assyria has conquered the northern kingdom, and now of Israel, the northern tribes, and now Babylon's taken over, and they're coming in. They're moving in for the kill, right? So they send envoys, and what does he do? He welcomes them. He showed them his treasure house. The silver, the gold, the spices, the precious oil, his whole armory, all that was found in his storehouses. There was nothing in his house or in all his realm that Hezekiah did not show them. Because he's an idiot? Like, why are you doing this? Then the prophet Isaiah came to King Hezekiah and said to him, "What did these men say? From where did they come to you?" And Hezekiah answered, "They have come to me from a far country, from Babylon." He said, "What have they seen in your house?" Hezekiah answered, "They've seen all that is in my house. There's nothing in my storehouses that I did not show them." We could have a little sidebar here, right? What possible reason could there be for doing this? And I was actually joking about this with actually with my parents, and my dad said, maybe he was thinking compared to them, he doesn't have a whole lot, so maybe they'll just decide just to leave him alone. I was like, that is the closest I've ever heard anyone come to explaining this in any way that makes any sense. So, yeah, maybe he wasn't off his rocker. But anyway, this is what he's saying, right? There's nothing in my storehouses that I did not show them. This next part always just makes me so uncomfortable. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your ancestors have stored up until this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. Some of your own sons who are born to you shall be taken away. They shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Like, you're an idiot. And then his response, this just takes, this is Father's Day material right here. Hezekiah said to Isaiah, the word of the Lord that you have spoken is good. For he thought, there will be peace and security in my days. I don't give a rat's ass about people coming after me. Yeah, number one father. Okay, so we go from that. This is the wrapping up of Isaiah the first Isaiah, because then we go look at the very next chapter. We go look at Isaiah 4. Oops, sorry, what just happened? Sorry, didn't mean to do that. And now I don't know what you all are seeing. Okay, Isaiah 40. Look at Isaiah 40, and it's poetic. It's poetic in form, right? It's poetry. It's lyrical. It's comfort. The first word, the first word out of their mouth. They're in exile is comfort. Oh, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. I'm trying not to freak out because I don't like the way the biblical texts blame God. God is punishing them with this exile. I think that's terrible theology. But it is the way they believed things to be back then. Unfortunately, a lot of people still today think this way because their scriptures teach them to think this way. So, it's kind of this, it's how they thought about it, but people are still reading it, and so they're still thinking about it this way. Right? I mean, a voice cries out, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be. So there's this prediction thing going on, right? Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. Then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. And, a voice says, cry out. And what shall I cry? All flesh is, all this stuff about, death and withering, and we need good news, right? O Zion, herald of good news, right? Get you up to a high mountain, herald of good news, right? We need comfort. We need something to encourage us, right? See, the Lord comes with might, and his arm rules for him, right? All this language about that I think is intended to give comfort to people, right? So this is the opening chapter of second Isaiah, right? Second Isaiah starts in chapter 40 and it goes through chapter 55. Oh my goodness. Today is a bad day for us. Okay. Right. So does everybody see what I'm getting at here? She's really adorable. She comes over and she just kind of pats, hey, I'm right here. I want to. Okay. All right. So let's go look at the suffering servant now. I think that's enough. That's enough of that. Okay, 52. Oops. I'm gonna start at I'm just going to start here at the beginning of this chapter. And let's see. No. Ah, that's not what I meant to do. There we go. Okay. Right. The kitties need comfort. Yes, they do. Comfort my kitty. Yes, indeed. Okay. So this is chapter 52, and I'm not going to do much more, kind of explaining here in terms of background, but I think it's helpful to read up to this point, the point where the suffering servant passage starts. So, sorry, this is funny. I'm just going to put this up here. Yeah. Republican or not, it's certainly something ridiculous. Anyway, it's just ridiculous. Okay, so we're still in Second Isaiah, right? We're in the middle. This is addressed to people in exile, right? So awake, awake, put on your strength, O Zion, put on your beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. For the uncircumcised and the unclean shall enter you no more. Shake yourself from the dust, rise up, O captive Jerusalem, right? They are in exile, right? They are captives. Loose the bonds from your neck, O captive daughter Zion. That's a repetition, right? A parallelism there. We have two lines being paralleled, right? For thus says the Lord, you were sold for nothing. Oh gosh, it's so hard today. We're just, yep. You were sold for nothing, and you shall be redeemed without money. For thus says the Lord God, long ago my people went down into Egypt to reside there as aliens. The Assyrian, too, has oppressed them without cause. Now, therefore, what am I doing here, says the Lord, seeing that my people are taken away without cause? Their rulers howl, says the Lord, and continually all day long. My name is despised by their rulers, right? By the people who have captured them. Therefore, my people shall know my name. On that day, they shall know that it is I who speak. It is I. And then this is familiar to many of you because this is a passage put to song. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace. How beautiful on the mountain, right? So this is chapter 52, right? We're still in the midst of needing to comfort, and this idea of bringing good news is very welcome, right? Who brings good news, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns in spite of the fact that you were separated from your God, because your God, they tended to have this belief in God's having, being connected to a location, right? So Yahweh's back there in Jerusalem and they're in exile, right? So this idea of, being reminded that your God reigns, even though you're not experiencing that right now, right? So, yeah. Listen, your sentinels lift up their voices. Together they shout for joy. For in plain sight they see the return of the Lord to Zion. Zion is a way to refer to Jerusalem. These are used interchangeably. Break forth, shout together for joy, you ruins of Jerusalem. For the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. Now, see, that's an interesting thing to say. It's a predictive kind of a thing. He has redeemed Jerusalem, meaning he's purchased them. He's bought them back, but they're still in exile. So it's not actually yet it hasn't fully come to be, but that's part of the encouragement, right? Is that it's going to happen. Right? So for the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. I remember singing, drawing a blank on his name, that back in my conservative days, fundy days, and one of the Christian singers that I really loved. I remember he put this that to song. It's a great song. Oh, what was his name? I bet some of you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, this is encouragement to them that this is true. This is going to happen, right? That all the nation, right? He's bared his holy, he's going to flex, right? God's about to flex to bring us home, right? Depart, go out from there, touch no unclean thing, go out from the midst of it, purify yourselves, right? You've been living in Babylon, take heed, prepare to return, all that stuff. You who carry the vessels of the Lord. For you shall not go out in haste. You shall not go in flight. For the Lord will go before you, and the God of Israel will be your rear guard. So, anytime that there's a predictive element, it is very near term prediction, as in, 5 to 10 years. It's not 5 to 10 centuries, right? It's just very near term, short term predictiveness kind of stuff. So now we get to this, see, my servant shall prosper. So I'm just going to replace that with my people, right? My servant. I mean, this is, and this is part of the thing that makes it easy for people to say, oh, look, he's predicting Jesus because it's just a single person. But like I said, there are other places in Isaiah, even in 2nd Isaiah, where the person writing uses a singular noun entity to refer to a group of people, but that happens often. So many times in the prophets, they refer to Israel or Judah as the wife of God, right? Or the people, my servant, the servant of God. What are some of the other? But I'm kind of hung up on the wife part because of how the only time the people are referred to as the wife of God is when God is trying to punish them, discipline them in some way. It's not funny at all. Right. So my people shall prosper. They shall be exalted and lifted up and shall be very high. Right. This is predictive, short-term predictive language, right? For people who are in Babylon and who want to be back, most of whom, not all, because some stay behind, most of whom who want to get back to Jerusalem, right? So just as there were many who were astonished at him, what is you, my servant, right? At you. So marred was his appearance beyond human semblance and his form beyond that of mortals. I mean, what is this trying to say, right? That the people of Israel, the Israelite people, right, were utterly destroyed when they were conquered by the Babylonians, right? So playing out a metaphor here, we've called the people a single person. So now, excuse me, I don't know what's going on. So now we're playing that metaphor out, right? You don't even recognize the people anymore, right? So he shall startle or scare. Startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which had not been told them, they shall see, and that which they had not heard, they shall contemplate. I don't even know what that means. Who has believed what we have heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he, the people, grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him. The people, right? The people weren't anything impressive. Nothing in its appearance that we should desire him. This is really a way to say what God says through the prophets over and over and over again. I chose you when nobody else wanted you. Or the really devastating, really gross one in Ezekiel 16, when it talks about, I saw you flailing in the blood of your birth. I chose you, and I watched you grow up into a teenager with curves and large breasts, and you were beautiful. I mean, literally, it's talking about how beautiful her hair is. and that she's curvy, like curvaceous woman. Like, what? It's just really kind of gross, right? Um, and and it's over and over. The language is saying, God is saying to these people, according to what's happening here, I chose you, and you weren't really all that desirable. I made something of you. Ugh. Right? So that's what's going on here. There was nothing that anyone would desire this. You all weren't, and you really weren't much of anything when I found you, right? He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering, or man of sorrows, and acquainted with infirmity. And as one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. So this is, again, this is talking about this group of people. At this point in time, we're talking beginning of the 6th century BCE, and the story, the narrative for them has been going on for several hundred years. They've still never really been terribly well established for very long on their own to be treated like a contender in the politics of the time. Surely he has borne our infirmities. This is where it gets really tricky to read as if God is talking to the people who are in exile. This one is tricky, but I hope you'll hang in there with me on this, right? Because ultimately, what helps me make sense of this is the really detrimental and harmful idea that when bad things happen to people, it's God punishing them, or God doing this for their good. Okay? And so when you see the suffering, and then we have this kind of a line, surely the people have borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. The infirmities, these things are about the punishment of not worshiping God correctly. Anytime something bad happens, God is doing it to them. They have stopped, they're not worshiping correctly. And so God does it to them over and over again. So surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. I want to just stick with this for just a second, so that you can have a minute to wrap your head around how this is using that theme that's a part of the Deuteronomistic history. It starts in the book of Deuteronomy, and it goes throughout the prophets. It goes throughout the former and the latter prophets, this idea that people were wounded for transgressions, that this is what God did. And so if you're looking at the people in exile, this is a punishment, and now the punishment, or whatever, the penalty has been served, right? They've served the sentence, and now they can be made whole. That is very, very biblical. That is not something that's specifically being used to talk about one person who's going to be nailed to a cross in another 600 years, right? And it's not like Jesus was the first and only Jew to be nailed to a cross by the Romans. There's all that as well. So anyway, okay. So he was, so the people are wounded for the transgressions. So whatever, in whatever ways the people, the leadership, the people in charge of things were not behaving properly. And that is what got the whole people as a whole got their asses whooped, right? It's terrible theology, but that is through and through in these prophetic books in particular. Okay. So all we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way. And the Lord has laid on him, as in the people, the iniquity of us all. I hope you can see a little bit of how this is actually quite consistent with biblical content, with biblical themes, in terms of the way the people believed, thought of themselves in relation to God, the way they thought of how God treated them, would treat them, did deal with them, right? Um, there's a good reason why people today will say, when something terrible happens to someone, they'll say, "What did you do to deserve that?" As if anyone deserves as if anyone deserves some sort of tragedy in their life, right? No. But it's a very ancient way of thinking about life, that when something goes wrong, we've offended the gods, right? We've offended the gods somehow. And the main trope, the main theme here for the ancient Israelite people was this issue of not worshiping just Yahweh and doing it correctly. And so when things go badly for the people, then they're looking for who is it? Who has caused this for us? He, the people, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice, he was taken away. I mean, that's an interesting thing to say, right? I don't disagree from the perspective of someone who's been taken captive that is a perversion of justice. I'm not challenging that. It's just these are really interesting things to think about in their historical context, right? Yeah, okay. You're also saying that God's doing it to you to punish you for something, but by perversion of justice, he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? This was not supposed to happen, right? We weren't supposed to be conquered by the Babylonians. Our temple was destroyed. Just the people, the things we loved and believed in, and that gave us security and identity, are just destroyed. Like, who would have imagined this, right? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich. What are these saying? And in his death with a rich person. Although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Again, I think it's really interesting that they're literally changing their tune here about, how this is working. But I think this is more honest. I think this is more true. But this isn't. It's challenging the 3 or 4 verses prior to it, which is fine. It's just really, I think, worth noting what's happening here. This kind of back and forth, these ideas back and forth. Yeah, it was the will of the Lord to. Oh God, every time it just makes me angry that people read this and believe this. It was the will of the Lord to crush him with affliction. Again, we're talking about the people and them having been conquered by a foreign entity. Many people, thousands of people killed, thousands carried off as captives, and to say that was God's will is just so gross to me. It really is. Okay, but again, that's what we're talking about. The prophet is talking about the people, trying to talk about this experience through this lens. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. That's it for the suffering servants segment. I actually wanted to go ahead and read one more. Oh, no, we're okay. I just saw what time it was. That's all right. We'll just leave it at that for today. We're still live. Okay, what happened to the comments? I lost my. Oh, there. I was like, wait, I lost all the comments. Okay, so that's the suffering servant segment, and I hope that that is helpful to have it to read through it that way with you and to show you how to understand it on its own terms. This is, this is why I like to talk about things like, what do you call the first 5 books of the Bible? I'm going to do some more of those where we talk about, well, what do you call the first Testament? Do you call it the Old Testament? And the second one, the New Testament? Do you call it by the name that the people who wrote it gave it? That's what I prefer to do because I find that more respectful of the texts and of the people who wrote them and collected them and passed them down. So for me, reading the prophets through the lens of not just historically, but also through the lens of the people for whom they were written, it's very important to me to do that. And to try to invite people, no matter what they're going to go back and do on their own. If I know that people are going to still keep reading it as if it's predicting Jesus, and we can use it. You can see how that can apply to the way people have been taught to interpret Jesus' execution. I think it's also worth pointing out that the way Paul makes sense of Jesus' execution is not the only way to make sense of Jesus' execution. Just be very clear about that too. Anyway, so that's it for today. I am thrilled that you all have been here, hanging out in the chat. I didn't see any specific questions that I need to take up or to respond to. But I also want to remind you that tonight is the live conversation with those. As soon as we end this, I'll send out the Zoom link to those who support me through Patreon. So it's 8 p.m. Eastern, US, for an hour, and I think there are a couple different topics that have been thrown out there. I'm pleased to see this. I hope you're not embarrassed that I'm going to share this, but I appreciate that you're doing that. Honestly, I try to call it the Hebrew Bible, and I call the New Testament the Newer Testament for all these reasons that I think it's more respectful to people. So I appreciate that there are others who are trying to do that as well. And so tonight the live conversation, and what else? We have another scholar coming on next week. His name is Christopher Skinner. He happens to be a New Testament scholar. It'll be fun to have him on next week. Not entirely sure what the topic is yet. So thank you for those of you who wanted to be here live, were able to be here, hanging out in the chat. I appreciate that. And for those who are watching it later, thank you so much. I appreciate all the ways that you support me and the work I'm doing. Hitting like, subscribing to my channel, telling friends about it, commenting, all those things help. I appreciate that. And then my supporting me through Patreon is also I'm just really grateful to those of you who are able to do that and want to do that. So thank you for that. I'm gonna wrap it up here with a little music and a little thanks to my Patreon supporters, and I'll see you all next week.